All right, we're about to be live on YouTube. Welcome everybody to our Philosophy of Freedom reading group. Today we'll be covering Chapter 2, The Fundamental Desire for Knowledge. And today Jonathan has offered to give us a summary, so I'll give the floor to Jonathan, and let's try to open for discussion 15 after. So.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I took on this task as a kind of a challenge to try and grasp the sort of the wholeness of the chat, to see if I could find like a through thread through it. And what I did was I've taken 14 paragraphs in this translation. They give some paragraph numbers in the original German that are slightly different maybe from the English paragraphing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out 14 sort of bullet points, as it were. So what the threads I found in each paragraph, and then after maybe I'll expand a little bit, because this is a bit kind of sparse, and maybe afterwards I can sort of point out, just address some of the, flesh out some of the bits to remind us of the whole of the chapter. So in chapter 1, we ended with, in a sense, the unity of thinking and love, where it was pointed out that thought is the father of feeling. And this chapter, the fundamental urge for knowledge, or the fundamental desire for knowledge, begins with desire. So we ended the last one with love, and we begin this with desire. Number one, we are disunited through our desire. Our wants and needs leave us unsettled as we are. They betray a sense of incompleteness, dissatisfaction, and inharmony. And so we look beyond for completion. Our mental life is a case of this. In our not knowing all at once, questions arise, and we desire to know more. 2, in our seeking beyond ourselves, existence splits in two, I and the world. 3, the gulf arises in and through consciousness, but in feeling, though less consciously, we remain united with the world. I'll dispense with the numbers now. Only by profoundly filling our consciousness with the world will we fully reconnect with it. Materialism attempts this, but just shifts the goalpost away without fully realizing it. Spiritualism tries to do this too, but finds itself left with the intractable problem of material appearances that it also cannot address. Idealism keeps the problem fully in our consciousness, but becomes lost in only our own thought activity. To try to overcome these one-sidednesses, we may oscillate between idealism and materialism, with each explaining the other in an endless, impossible circle. Or we may fuse the dichotomy into a basic identity and leave unaddressed how that single identity manages to express as two differences through its simple identity. All these dead ends will not suffice. It's no use looking for the solution out there, for it is we, in and through our consciousness, who separate the unity. Yet we cannot act alone. The world also acts in us. Her acts are our acts hers. Clearly, we must seek out that which is natural in us in order to rediscover our connection to the natural out there. Where we are no longer solely ourselves, but also more than ourselves, must be where we overcome the riddle of I and world. It is not a type of specialized knowing or knowledge that we consider here, but things as they are day to day for our consciousness. So you can see, I think I kind of tried to pare it down to the bone, and I think you can see a kind of thread through it. And it's even possible to kind of, there's 14 paragraphs to bring them back. So each mirrors the other, but in a kind of like in a, it's not a complete mirror, but it develops, the thoughts develop. So that's my summary, but I'll just briefly sort of highlight a few things that I didn't bring here. Like in point 4, only by profoundly filling our consciousness with the world will we fully reconnect with it. He makes the point that that is our cultural history, religion, art, and now science. And we could say like the able, nature, religious, seeking revelation to provide the lack, or the artistic nature, the Cain nature, artifice, all the things we invent to try and make the world like us, so to sort of overcome that disharmony. And then now the new, the scientific consciousness, the thinking consciousness. But he makes that important point that it needs to be a lot more profound than we generally take it. And yeah, so it's interesting that he notes 3 individuals. One is Fichte, and he sees him as, although in a sense he's an idealist, he was such an absolute idealist. Steiner styles him as a spiritualist. And then in the idealism that he mentions, that we get lost in our thought activity, I see echoes of Kant and all that kind of stance in that, whereby we say it's all structured by us. We can't get beyond ourselves in that way. And then he goes to Lang, this very interesting kind of ping pong between idealism and materialism, where matter makes our ideas, but then matter only comes to us through our ideas. And so one makes the other. And he raises that idea of the Baron Munchausen, who lifts himself by his own hair. And I think that's generally what we sort of mostly tend to do, in the sense that, we tend to think, well, the world, I see red, but nobody sees my red. So the world sort of comes to me in this, in idealism, it's a fabrication through me. But then on the other hand, we say, yes, but there's all those objective material things out there that determine the brain, that determines how things come to us. And so it just goes round in this kind of endless, unresolvable circle. And he points to the resolution of that in the concluding parts of the chapter. I won't say any more about the rest of it. I'll leave that for all of us.
Thank you, Jonathan. Wonderful summary. You did guide us along the through line there quite well. Appreciate that to launch us into this discussion. I see Jacob's hand is up already, so we'll turn it over to you, Jacob.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, I thought I'd connect up with that summary, because a couple of the points that were raised connect up to things I kind of marked as I was going through the chapter. The first thing was this passage where Steiner says that there's something more which we seek in things over and above what is immediately given to us in them, splits our whole being into two parts, and so on. Something that Georg Kulevind brings out quite well, which I think is useful here, is the sense that part of what allows for the emergence of the consciousness that Steiner is talking about here, the one that experiences itself as to some extent separate from the world, is also a certain opacity in the world that's experienced, because of the other things that he says about thinking, that thinking has this character where we forget ourselves in thinking and we're aware primarily of the object of thinking, that that we almost need this kind of semi-opaque object, that the world as not immediately intelligible to us, in order to reflect back the thinking activity which would otherwise not be conscious. And so in a way I think the point here is that the emergence of this initial sort of separate self-consciousness and the fact that the world becomes a problem that needs to be explained are two sides of the same event, in a way. That was the one thing. And the other thing was about Steiner's interesting critique of idealism in this chapter, the bit where he instead of going on to penetrate through the world of ideas to the spiritual world, idealism identifies the spiritual world with the world of ideas itself. Here, I just wanted to share with you a short quote from a wonderful book about Thomas Aquinas by a French Thomist called Pierre Rousselot. It's called The Intellectualism of St. Thomas. And it's directly connected to this, that Steiner passage. It is in fact, this is the quote, it is in fact the fundamental principle of his, in other words, Aquinas's metaphysical intellectualism, that every spiritual person is an idea, and there is perfect identity between idea and spiritual reality. Pure spirits, subsisting intelligibles, are the true ideas, or noumena, as we would say today. Intelligibility is something that belongs essentially to living and substantial beings. So that the reason I shared that with you is, I think what Steiner is really pointing to in that subtle criticism of idealism is that it still treats the supposed spiritual or intelligible interior of nature as if it was akin to ideas that are observable by introspection, whereas in reality, what happens in the spiritual world is the activity of actual individual spiritual beings. It's not like a realm of sort of quasi-perceptual objects, ideas just floating around. So anyway, that was
Thank you, Jacob, for that context, providing some fleshing out, as it were, what Steiner's criticism of idealism was in this chapter. I put my hand up to get in line, but I see Jeff is actually next, so I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Jonathan, I have a question for you, and I guess really for everyone, but it's nice to direct it through you with your nice 14-point summary. So Jonathan / everyone, are you familiar with the idea that's been put forward about the structure of philosophy of freedom? I know, actually, Angus, I know you know the answer to this too, but the structure of the book being fundamentally based on Steiner's, what he put out in 1918 in the lecture, Human and Cosmic Thought, where the 12 worldviews and the 7 soul moods form, like each chapter follows like clockwork, follows the 12 worldviews. Steiner, he shifts from materialism, all the way through all the 12. And then the 14 chapters are really the 7 worldviews in duplicate. So I'm just asking Jonathan first if you know that idea. I know Angus does, of course, and anyone else, if you've interacted with that content on philosophyofreedom.com.
No, I didn't know that. I'm very grateful for that insight. I've started a study which tries to look at the thinking in it in the sense of how it develops. It's a bit like what I did, how one thing builds from the other, but in an organic fashion, not just a kind of Lego blocks fashion. But I wasn't aware of this, the worldviews and the 7 soul moods being within it as well. It's fascinating. Thanks.
I wasn't aware of that connection either, so I'm gonna have to follow that up. Thanks for bringing it to our attention, Jeff. I wanted to just make a few brief remarks about really these last few paragraphs in this chapter. When Steiner is directing us to find our way back to nature by finding that in ourselves, which is in fact nature arising in our own being. And he mentions Goethe earlier. He doesn't mention Schelling by name, but I couldn't help but notice the resonance and the almost word for word rearticulation of some of the insights from Schelling's philosophy of nature. And I want to share some lines from Schelling's 1797 book. I shared this in the volley already. I'll share it here for those who aren't in the volley. Schelling wrote a book called Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature. And unlike Goethe, who was not as philosophical and speculative, but more focused on seeing and observing direct experience, as it were, Schelling was quite speculative. He certainly had a profound experiential connection with the divine and the cosmos, but his philosophy can get more abstract and speculative. And let me share this line from Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, and then try to connect it to something Steiner says in the next paragraph here. So, Steiner says we can find nature outside us only if we have first learned to know her within us. What is akin to her within us must be our guide. Schelling says, so long as I myself am identical with nature, I understand what a living nature is, as well as I understand my own life. As soon, however, as I separate myself, and with me everything ideal from nature, nothing remains to me but a dead object, and I cease to comprehend how a life outside me can be possible. In this book, Schelling is concerned more with articulating a vision of nature which would recognize it as organic, as having a life of its own, trying to combat a kind of mechanistic, Cartesian, Newtonian vision that's different from Steiner's project in this book, who's trying to direct us inward to our own consciousness. But nonetheless, the polarity here and the sense in which we have to overcome this split that sense perception and our own consciousness of sense perception creates within ourselves. I think you can see the influence of Schelling on Steiner here in some of his statements. But when Steiner says everything he is saying here is not scientific, it's not speculative, it's just a description of what every one of us experiences in his own consciousness, I can't help but feel like he's saying that out of this German idealist tradition, and that, someone coming to these questions from a different set of, from a different philosophical milieu might not agree that this is a simple description of our experience. The other thing I wanted to share is his statement, very enigmatic statement. Investigation of our own being must give us the answer to the riddle. We must reach a point where we can say to ourselves, here we are no longer merely I, here is something which is more than I. And it reminded me immediately of the New Testament, Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verse 20, where he says basically, not I, but the Christ in me. And more specifically, in the King James Version, he says, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And this split that Steiner has been describing earlier in the chapter seems to me to be something like a kind of crucifixion, and rediscovering our connection, rediscovering the way that our own thinking is itself, in some way, nature coming to consciousness of itself, is this kind of resurrection that Paul is describing. And I can't help but think that Steiner's hearing Paul echo as he makes this statement about no longer merely I, but something more than I. And it also reminds me of Schelling's view of how what he calls reflection, or this split between our own thinking and our sense experience of outer nature, is a kind of spiritual sickness, Schelling says, but that we needed to experience this sickness in order to become self-conscious and free, capable of free action, right? So a lot of consonance here between Schelling, Steiner, the New Testament. I just wanted to throw these ideas into the mix. Angus, you're next.
Thanks for that, Matt. That was. I'm going to be talking about something else, but I'd love to be talking about what you just brought up there as well. I'm going to, in your volley, just before that, I made like a reference to a dewdrop poem. It's like just as a picture also of this idea of, it's like I in the world as a microcosm of the macrocosm. When we look out across a field of dewdrops, in every single dewdrop, the whole world is potentially reflected. And I think these type of images are very, very appealing to both to the senses, but as a content for meditating on. But before, and then I wanted to make another point before I get to my main point, which is something that I just learned today that I don't know if anybody else has noticed, but there are quite a few italicized words in the book. Has anybody else noticed that? There is a significance to this. This is Steiner's way of underlining important things, important concepts that he's bringing up. So I really like the way Jonathan approached summarizing the chapter, and just thinking another way of summarizing the chapter is which are the points that Steiner has decided to underline and have those as a focus for discussion. But that was more like a by the by that I discovered whilst I was reading around. My focus is on the cross that he brings up in this book, the cross that will, it's like, in part become the human and cosmic thought, which Jeff was referring to there with the 12 worldviews and the 7 soul moods. But what is this cross that he's building up there? He talks about spiritism as material and materialism as like two fundamental directions in which the soul can address itself. And then if you look at this, when this is schematized, it's often it doesn't matter whether it's spirit above and material below or vice versa, but always at 90 degrees on the horizontal, you've got idealism and realism. And he goes quite a bit into idealism when he brings up Fichte, but he uses some very strange words here. He says, we are thus referred back to the outer world. The most extreme spiritualist, or perhaps the thinker who, through his absolute idealism, presents himself as an extreme spiritualist, is Fichte. And this isn't the first time I've wondered about this question. I mean, idealism in my mind has essentially a long time been a form of spiritism. but Steiner's indicating here that no, there's something else going on. And I'm chucking this idea out because it's something that's come new to me, and I'd love to have people's think on it and feedback on it. But I wonder if it's a little bit like a sort of a spirit trapped in a soul, and I'm going to explain why I might think that in a second. It's a soul that sort of feels the spirit but doesn't recognize the spirit. And there are a couple of strands to this thinking. One is that in GA 161, he's talking about Hegel as another idealist, of course, and he says that where is it? Hegel has achieved thought that is the deepest which can be thought in earthly life, but which must lose its configuration with death. Hegel's tragedy lies in the fact that he did not realize he grasped the spirit in logic, in nature, in soul life, but only the spirit that exists in the form of thought and does not accompany us when we go through death. So he's giving a little bit the same flavor as he's talking about Fichte here. There's sort of it's a conception of the spirit that isn't a full-blooded conception of the spirit. And so that sends my thinking off in a few different directions. And one of those is the abolition of the essential abolition of the spirit in the church. That it's I think it was as early as it's the Council of 869, possibly in I can't remember where it was. It might have been Nice as well. I'm not sure. Where the church authorities basically tried to conflate soul and spirit. There was no difference. There was no significant difference, and that this my question to myself is: has this been sort of carried through as a tradition in philosophical thinking, so that there's not an ability to distinguish between soul and spirit, and that this is perhaps a little bit of idealism? But of course, Plato was an idealist as well, so it's not as simple as all that. I'm throwing thoughts out there because I'm a bit clear on my thinking, but I'm still not crystal clear. But I mentioned this cross, so you've got idealism going off to one side, but he never mentions the other side, which is realism. Or in the medieval period, it would actually be realism plus nominalism. But realism is nominalism, in modern day parlance. But this is exactly what Goethe brings to the table, in that he's making experiential content. I can't remember if it was in one of the lectures or whether it was actually in this particular book. But both Fichte and Hegel, as idealists, are accused of creating these wonderful thought constructions, but without experiential content. And that's where Goethe is fundamentally different from these people. It's the spirit is seen to engender life, so it becomes manifest. It's in the material plane. Not sure how jumbled those thoughts came across. There's a lot going through my mind at the moment, but I wanted to share those thoughts with the group.
Thanks, Angus. I was looking for Goethe's statement about Fichte, that he had hoped Fichte could explain Kant to him, but it left him even more confused, which might not have been Fichte's fault, but Lorenzo, you're up.
Yep. I had a reflection for the group. I was struck by Steiner's criticism of the monistic position in this chapter, when he says that monism, I'm translating from Italian, that monism tried to negate either spirit or materialism, or matter and spirit are everywhere conjunct, and then there's no need to wonder why they they appear so so removed from one another in our experience. And linking this to what he says just at the end of the chapter, when he says that we are part of nature and nature is inside us, made me think that maybe his criticism to the monistic position is just a criticism of the arguments that monism has used up to that point, and he wants to lead us there with a different line of thought. And so I was thinking about this thing that we are part of nature, while nature is in all of us. And I thought of the hierarchies, because then maybe we can think about the existence of others, yes, and of something that is beyond the I, okay, but maybe all these different I's are grouped together, and if we could read, let's say, God's mind, or anyway the thought of the of nature itself, of that whole of which we all are part, but that is in itself whole, then the divide between thought and matter would be no more. There would be no temporal / material remaining to thought that has to develop, but it would just be an image with a perfect, let's say, juxtaposition of realism and idealism. So what is your thought about this? Is the hiatus between the monistic position he's criticizing in this chapter and Steiner's own position a matter of hierarchy? Is the concept of hierarchy that is still missing there? Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting question, Lorenzo. I would almost say it's not hierarchy so much as holography, perhaps. And when we say the human is a part of nature, I think what Steiner's trying to direct us to is the idea that each human individual is in some sense a recapitulation of the whole of nature.
But at the same time, he says that we must reach that moment when we can say for sure this is something more than I. So there is this, yes, this divide that he struggles to maintain. It's not just an idealistic position in the sense of Fichte. So what is beyond the I, if we still have to reach at the end, let's say, monistic point of view and solve the divide between idealism and realism. So maybe it's just that my I and your eyes are all inside one bigger I, and to whom there is no there's nothing beyond. And but I mean, that's just my thought. I don't know what you.
I think of Angus's dewdrops again. I think of the dewdrops, but let's see what others think. Jacob, I see your hand next.
You're muted, Jacob.
You're still muted. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll be quick because I've already spoken, but I just wanted to connect up with the point about Paul. Some of you may be aware of this already, but if you aren't, Steiner much later made the connection between St. Paul and the philosophy of freedom himself. I forget the date now or which work it was in, but anyway, this is the most relevant passage. So he's talking about the philosophy of freedom. I must call these thoughts on epistemology Pauline for the following reason: that the world in the first form of its appearance to the senses seems to us unreal, and that our subjective activity converts it into reality. The Pauline theory of knowledge, when taken into the philosophical realm, is nothing else than that man, on entering the world as the first Adam, experienced it only partially, and through Christ experienced the whole of reality. So, yeah, I thought it's worth noting that Steiner makes that connection explicit himself. And I just very quickly also wanted to comment on the question of monism. Seems to me that part of the question is the sort of monism at issue, and that what I think Steiner would be objecting to, for instance, would be a monism that doesn't grasp the central role of the human eye, of the knower in relation to nature, and it tries to see the unity as somehow subsuming the eye, so that the eye just becomes the knower becomes just another entity within nature, whereas it seems that for Steiner the human being has this privileged place, that somehow nature speaks itself through humanity, and ultimately, yeah, that's.
Thanks, Jacob, for making the Pauline connection explicit. And I agree with your take on the form of monism that Steiner's critiquing versus what he's proposing. Max, you're next. Good to have you here, Max.
Yes, thank you for, thank you to Matt and to Ashley and to all of you for just putting this on the initiative. I guess I just had 2 points that in a certain way I feel are building off of even what Jacob said also most immediately, but I think also in a way a lot of what has already been laid out. And I guess I'll just try to build off what Jacob said first. And that's the idea. Well, I would just like to relate, I guess, the question of monist and dualist theories to what Steiner explicitly says is the sort of like spirit. Well, I think he uses the word spiritual striving, or the term spiritual striving of all humanity. This idea of trying to reconcile the sense of exile or isolation that people feel. And I would just, as a kind of like reflection on all of the almost like the motive force of the writing through this chapter, he's basically demonstrating that same kind of thing, where we're trying to come up with an adequate way of seeing our own relationship to the outer world and our own activity of perception. We're trying to come up with a way of seeing that, like a theory of seeing that, which promises actually to doesn't leave us stranded in the kind of exile that we feel now. And I thought it was just worth reflecting on the fact that Steiner's both talking about something that he sees as a hallmark of human spiritual striving, and also at the same time as he's doing that, he's also taking part in exactly what he's describing. So he's describing something, but he's also performing it. And the second point, I guess I can just use also what Jacob said as a segue, but it would be the idea of kind of building off of the idea of polarity. And my impression, like if I were trying to summarize the whole chapter with an image, I was trying to settle on the right image, and I would picture almost like a glass blower blowing a glass, and you create. What you do by blowing the glass is you actually polarize an inside from an outside, whereas to begin with you have kind of undivided space. By blowing the glass, you've polarized that undivided space into an inside space and an outside space, and at least to me that to me seems to be what Steiner is characterizing throughout this chapter in respect. Not obviously, that's a spatial metaphor for something that's that's not spatial, which is rather, has to do with our own consciousness. And then the idea is, how can we begin to then this is building back to the first point, how can we begin to see that sort of polarity not as a disjunction, but again as a relationship. And just to complete the thought, the idea is like the polarity is not bad, really. It feels bad maybe, but in a certain way, the polarity is meant to serve as the kind of like catalyst, or almost a spark that will kindle our own spiritual activity, our own like the human being, our own spiritual activity, and in a certain way, almost like raise us towards a higher degrees of collaboration in the economy of creation. So I'll end there. I'd love to hear if anyone wants to build up that, but I know it's many people have other things to say.
Yeah, thanks for that image, Max, of the glass blower. And it makes me think of the need to, once this internal space has been created, to keep inwardizing, as it were, to form a Klein bottle. If you're familiar, it's kind of like a torus, but like to reconnect with nature from the inside out once that interior space has been forged that appears to separate us from it. If you guys are unfamiliar with the Klein bottle, just Google it. It's a neat image. Ashton, you're up.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks, Max, for that image. Even though it's spatial, it's still, manifesting the polarity. So I think it's still great. And yeah, I just also wanted to build on what has been spoken about, especially with Jacob mentioning just the sort of the mutuality between like the world becoming more opaque at the same time that the experience of the eye is sort of, called into consciousness. And just to, I guess, emphasize that what stuck out to me in this chapter were the couple moments when Steiner was insisting that we return to an examination of, or a phenomenology of our consciousness, and sort of insisting that there's like an evolutionary, that this text as a catalytic text is being offered in the midst of an evolutionary process. And so I think that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about like the metaphysics of monism or what have you, because if we're sort of asking, I guess, questions around like what kind of metaphysics is Steiner trying to propound in this text, without keeping in mind as well the historical dimension, where this estrangement has come about rather than being a sort of fixed characterization of consciousness, then yeah, I think that's partially why it might not be completely clear what kind of monism is being espoused, is because there's we're, I guess, being invited into a kind of activity. And Matt, I also, I think it's true definitely that, the way Steiner's characterizing this is arising out of the German idealist tradition. But I do think that I think that it's not just a matter of framing things according to the German idealist tradition, but that there is, in some sense, some not complete universality, I guess, across the globe, but especially with technologies being exported around the world and a certain conceptual attitude toward the world becoming pretty ubiquitous, and also like a critical orientation towards religiosity, where it's not easy in our day to naively, I guess, participate in one's faith or what have you, because in the globalized context, there's all these examples of otherwise. which I feel like is connected with this experience of the I and the desire for knowledge, and the severance from the inwardness of the world. So anyway, those are some thoughts. I'll stop there.
Yeah, appreciate those thoughts, Ashton. Putting us back in the historical context of the evolution of consciousness when we ask these questions about metaphysical proposals. Super important to remember that. Chad, love to hear from you.
Thank you. Wow, so many rich ideas here. People are saying, and I hope that it's what I'm going to say is coherent with what Max said, and maybe not building off of, but initially when I first read the beginning, and just like when he describes how we see a tree as first still, but then in motion, I couldn't help but to think of Ian McGilchrist's hemisphere hypothesis, and how the left hemisphere abstracts and gets the point, but the right hemisphere sees the whole, sees the motion. And to reflect on the nature of reality as described by quantum theory is that light and matter are both particle and wave. They demonstrate both properties as a fixed object, but also in motion, and that it seems as though our brain and the way we cognize the world, our consciousness together, both is as above, so below in that sense, with the nature of reality itself, coherent in that sense. And then to hear what was offered, that the book is structured on the 7 souls and the 12, I forget how Steiner describes it, but this is an astrological reference, the 12 signs, the 7 planets. And the way I think we can recognize archetypal astrology, the astrological perspective, is, this may sound heretical, but as an instantiation of the second coming, the logos, astro logos is the word, the star speak, or it's, and they go back to the first chapter of and even the preface of what motives are and how we can come into relationship with the motives. Our birth chart reflects an archetypal depth, the motives from which we are participating. And I think what may be happening here is that in the evolution of consciousness, the indwelling of the I that is separated from the original picture consciousness, as it was described in the Riddles of Philosophy, that this is what's necessary for the new type of the way Max described, I can't articulate it now, the new our co-creative articulation and coherent with the way we manifest the world in the future. That wasn't what you said at all, but that somehow this is what is happening, that we needed to differentiate and have the I, but we can come into a new relationship with what is the divine, the word, the logos, through what wasn't possible before the discovery of the 3 outer planets, and the evolution of consciousness of the indwelling of the I. Maybe I'll stop there. My thoughts are a little jumbled, but yeah, I'm really excited by the text and by everything that everyone is saying. So yeah, thanks. Hope that was coherent.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. It just makes me think that what's shifted in terms of the astrological perspective in the ancient world, which was more fatalistic, and the contemporary possibilities there, is that it's more participatory, and that the human individual is afforded the freedom to be in relationship with those planetary and astrological powers. All right. So thanks for bringing that in. Teresa, you're next.
Thanks, Matt. Yes, so just going on the back of what Max was saying with our spiritual striving, and just at the beginning of the chapter, where Steiner says we never lose the feeling that we belong to the world, that a link exists that connects us to it. And then gently guiding us to, for humankind to bridge that separation. So I just wrote some notes where, so Steiner presents the practice of spiritual striving to find that connection between humanity and the cosmos. And so this is key for me, where the human being seeks to find spirit in self in order to connect with spirit in nature. And so that also brings me to a work by Marco Pogatnik, I think it's the way we pronounce it. He wrote a publication about nature spirits and elemental beings, and then which connects to what Lorenzo was talking about, I think, in terms of the hierarchic levels, where there's different hierarchies in terms of spirituality within nature. I might be going off on a tangent here, but yeah, so Marco Pogatnik talks about environmental spirits can be seen as possessing a physical body, such as in plants, mountains, and animals. So where I'm going with this is when Steiner's directing us to find the spirit within ourselves in order to find the spirit within nature, to make that connection. I see myself looking to literature that will help me find that spirituality in the natural world, and authors like Marco Pogatnik seem to resonate with me in that sense. But yeah, I'll leave that there.
Thanks so much, Teresa, for throwing more nourishing ingredients into the mix here. Jacob, you're up.
Just assuming no one else is waiting, because I'm aware I'm more than usually chatty today. I just wanted to connect up with the point about the developmental and the structure. It's not something I've thought about before, but it occurs to me it might be interesting to consider how the structure of the philosophy of freedom might relate to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Partly I thought of that because it's not so clear with the epistemological side of the book, but when you get to the questions about morality, it's quite clear that Steiner sees this kind of evolutionary dimension, that in a sense, there's all of this stuff that's presupposed, and the freedom that he's ultimately going to talk about is a kind of a final highest fruit of this preceding development. So it presupposes previous, laws and a certain sort of formation. But even in the epistemological side of the book, the fact, for instance, that he mentions the way in which this intertwined relationship between the world being questionable and the separate consciousness emerging, it's quite unusual, because unlike a more typical epistemological approach that just starts from the assumption of a gap that needs to be bridged, he's actually describing the emergence of the gap. So yeah, that's
definitely makes this a uniquely evolutionary approach to understanding philosophy. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken that would like to chime in here before we wrap up? We've got a few minutes left. I saw your hand, Jonathan. Let's give folks just a minute if they want to think of how to articulate something. Otherwise, All right. Jonathan, go ahead. If you still have your comment.
Yeah,
in mind.
just quickly on that last point, because I think it's it kind of is obvious to me, at least, when it's seen that it's not just a unique take on philosophy, but I think it's the only way that it could be a resolution, because as Jacob said, normally the split is noticed, but then you see a split, what do you do with it? But if you know how the split was created, then there's already the kind of the answers in there. So it's sort of
if the split was sort of established totally irrespective of us, like by something happening to us, there would be no prospect of our own collaboration in repairing that same split. And Steiner makes the point repeatedly in this chapter. He says over and over again, like, the problem with these worldviews is he uses the word displace at least twice in the chapter. He says they displace the single point at which you could actually set to work to repair this problem. And over again, he's trying to actually redirect and reorient our attention back to the single place where we could get a start on this.
Yep. Jeff, I see your hand.
I think that's an incredibly important point. And I think the way in which he brought anthroposophy, generally speaking, as a way to stop the devolutionary process that you're describing, Max, that we are seemingly in a self-sabotage as relates to these questions. And then also I wanted to say that bringing Goethe's quote back, that in that quote, Goethe doesn't say that we're separate. He says there's this cleave that almost separates us. And I think that's important. I won't elaborate on that importance because we're short on time, but I would say also when Steiner brings up religion, art, and science or thinking, he's talking about three ways of knowing that can be entwined, and that I actually think he is starting to achieve beginning with this chapter, if not before. So those are just a few distilled thoughts. And also, I think this is the beginning of this chapter is the seeds for a science of karma and reincarnation.
We have about a minute left. Any closing thoughts? This has been so rich. I can't imagine where we're going to end up in another 10, 12 weeks as we continue deepening. We're really cooking now. Angus, go ahead. Still muted.
I think we can come back to where we finished off last week, where we were talking about regions of the soul, because like on the final page, what does he say? So once we've recognized the nature of this separation, that it's self-induced or self-sabotage, as somebody just said, I thought that's a nice expression. We wish to descend. So our way is thus mapped out for us. We do not wish to speculate about the interaction of nature and spirit. We wish to descend into the depths of our own being, to find those elements that we have saved in our flight from nature. This deepening of the soul that he continually harkens back to. It's like in the preface to this, the end of the riddles of philosophy. It's an intensification of the inner life that will show us the way out of this false monism or false dualism, obviously.
All right, wonderful. We've reached the completion of our hour together. I've had a lovely time thinking with all of you. Next week, we'll do chapter 3, Thinking in the Service of Knowledge. Enjoy reading that chapter.
I have a quick question, Matt. Is there a way to get the chat thread? Because there's things in there I'd like to read again.
Yeah, actually, why don't
you can save the chat. There's a little button down there, press the three dots, more,
Okay.
save chat, and it saves it to your folder.
Thanks, Angus.
Mine says open in all meetings and close doc. Oh, wait. I think I got it. Save chat. Got it.
Got it.
Thank
Cool.
you.
All right.
Thanks, Angus. Awesome.
All right, everyone. See you next week.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Look forward to
Bye.
it. Thanks, guys and girls.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.